Correct. White Americans would not experience racism. Correct.
Would not or don't?
They
I
wouldn't
might
be.
not be
They
quoting
wouldn't
it
be.
right.
They wouldn't be able to. It would be impossible
Would-
for them to experience it.
Well, I know some pretty good examples of racism that has occurred on white Americans. So I'd like to know the reason, why do you think it would not be possible for them to experience that?
Because racism has to be backed by systems or structures that enact specifically racist outcomes against different groups. My direct definition of racism that I use is the oppression of one racial group for the political, social, or economic benefit of another social group. And Black people, actually no race other than white people in America, are able to do that because the systems that operate in our country are strictly white supremacist systems. So no structures.
Touch on that basis, so we have an equal, I guess, base of understanding. But so people can make up the system, and the system/state is a conglomerate of the people. So if the issue is that you have a state that is racist and it has to be systematically racist, does it have to be, since the system is intrinsically tied to the state and the people?
Yes.
Isn't it just a general societal value rather than a state value or a people value?
No, I believe racism has to be systemic, and in order to be a racist, you have to uphold a system of racism. That would be my belief in looking at it, and I believe that countering that with like white people can experience racism is just a tool of white supremacy to kind of mask itself and show here, well, see, it's not that bad. Racism against Black people isn't terrible because white people can experience it too. Or racism against this group isn't bad because white people also experience it.
Take on your side.
You think it's a what?
Are you saying that if I were to take that argument, I am somehow blanketing the neo-Nazi or the white supremacist movements in the United States and giving them a benefit, or is it the assumption that I am one of those types?
No,
Because
I would say arguing that white people can experience racism is a white supremacist talking point. It's not calling you a white supremacist. It's just saying that is a tool of white supremacy to make it so that people don't focus on what's actually going on, which is that every system we have in this country is perpetrated is set up to perpetrate white supremacy, as opposed to the opposite.
But it doesn't always perpetrate. It's not successful at it. And what I want to break at this is, I'm not going to be able to change what your idea is on how racism comes about and what it takes to qualify as racist, but I can argue that Irish Americans who came here, much like you don't call yourself African American, there's something else for it, but just like how you people came here and were treated badly, so were the Italians and the Irish and the Jews and the Dutch.
Yeah, so when we look at the oppression of Irish Americans, because it did exist, that was oppression done from one white racial group to another white racial group. So white supremacy will oftentimes target other white groups to kind of hide itself, because at the end of the day, white supremacy exists to prop up a capitalist power structure. So white supremacy exists to make sure that like poor people stay poor and rich people stay rich. And if rich white people realize white people realize they can do that by throwing some white people under the bus, they're going to. But the second the structures start to change in any meaningful way, they're going to bring back in those white people in the fold to target other minorities. So for an example of this, directly with what you brought up, the dock worker unions in the early 1900s were created with Black and Italian people. Right. So, or I'm sorry, Irish American, no, Italian Americans. Sorry, Italian Americans. So Black and Italian Americans. It probably was Irish Americans as well. So Black in Irish and Italian Americans started to form docker unions because of the mistreatment, and then the people that owned these companies were like, "Hey, this is bad for us. So what can we do to kind of stop this?" So what they did is they said, okay, well, the Irish and Italian Americans, you guys can form unions and we'll give you better working conditions, but you have to leave the Black people in the dust because we are not doing that. And they did. The second they were able to reintegrate back into whiteness, they left the Black Americans in the dust. So this is just how white supremacy operates, and it's how it's been able to survive so long is via these kind of shady practices.
Well, I think that proper white supremacy doesn't include the Irish, doesn't include the Italians. It doesn't include a lot of those ethnic groups of quote unquote white plurality.
It definitely does now.
Right, and that's a modernist concept, and that's also the ideas behind these racial talking points. I myself am not a supremacist. Done plenty of work against that and to sort of rectify anything that I could have done for that. Not going to be a slavery apologist, but in the long term of American history, you guys aren't the only ones who have been oppressed. And just because we got
I'm not claiming we are,
doesn't mean that we wouldn't have taken it. If you guys were given a way out, you would have taken it as well. The 60s are a very prime example of that due to all of the welfare. You could say
so I would disagree, because we have constant evidence of Black people not taking an easy way out, right? Like you can see this in the you can see this in the combination of Jewish and Black Americans fighting for the Civil Rights Union. They didn't throw each other under the bus, even when given ample opportunity to. They stuck together to get the Civil Rights Act passed.
Well, if taking care of your own people, so to speak, not in a racial way, in a literal way, Black community cares for the Black community. All communities should care for one another. But in retrospect of your own community, would it not be wise to help raise your own people rather than go out of your way for direct
at the
equality,
cost of somebody else? No.
No,
at the cost of another community? No, I don't think that's a good thing.
Didn't say at the cost of another community. I said it.
Oh, okay. Yes, you should look out for your community, as long as the looking out for them isn't throwing somebody else under the bus. Yeah.
It shouldn't be right. We're not trying to throw each other under the bus. I'm just saying there should be a priority on one's community. It doesn't have to be racial. It can be cultural. It can be ethnical. It can be whatever it has to be. But that unifying factor is what that person belongs to.
But the problem is the separation of these communities is what is a white supremacist ideal, right? White supremacy separated these communities to begin with, right? And then the minute it was beneficial for them, they reintegrated some of the separate communities so they could further target a different community.
Sure you're just not running parallels between Americanization? Because that just sounds like you have had there were individuals who have Americanized properly. Not saying the Blacks can't, but there's been a long period of them being pushed into simpler areas and smaller areas where they can't interact in that way to assimilate. So
the problem is assimilation is a white supremacist tool. Right. When we look at racism and we're analyzing racism, there are three sort of camps someone can fall into.
Well,
hold on. There are three sort of camps someone can fall into. They can be a separationist, an assimilationist, or they can be an anti-racist. Those are the only three you can be. A separationist is somebody who goes, I don't want to be near people of other races. An assimilationist is that these other races and cultures need to act like me in order for me to accept them. And then an anti-racist recognizes that different cultures act different ways, different groups of people act different ways, and they look to celebrate the different cultural those different cultural distinctions without forcing people to act quote unquote white, which is what assimilation kind of tends to lead.
It does, but then again, I'm also not referencing racial assimilation or cultural assimilation. I'm talking about national assimilation.
Yeah, but the only way, how would you nationally assimilate? Like how would Irish Americans who were discriminated against, right? The same, not the same way, but slightly different than Black Americans were, but both were oppressed around the early 1900s. How do they assimilate How do they assimilate into Americanism when Black people had also been here for hundreds of years, but they had not assimilated? Like, what was it that Irish Americans did to change? Because they didn't change anything about their culture.
Overall, it's the input. I mean, if we're going to go down the route of what caused such successful assimilations, it happened between the Dutch, the Italians, the Jews, and the Irish, all four groups. The only reason I would assume that it occurred is because there wasn't a preset slavery route and or a segregation route. I think because of those factors, it was extremely implored that you would not race mix. Racial ideology was higher at that time. I think going through all of it, if you want to say that, it would be because of slavery and cultural background. White people,
this doesn't. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Would assimilate easier. Well, I'm just saying that the assimilation of Irish people into American nationality is easier than a Black man, depending on where he's from. And this is a national thing, not a racial thing. So
yeah, but my question is, the ability to assimilate, or not even a question, but the ability to assimilate to the American nationality is white supremacy, right? The fact that it is easier for white Americans to assimilate to the American nationality than it is for Black Americans to. That would be white supremacy.
You're making a very big argument on a racial nationalism, and I don't I think if we want to go down the route of old-timey American nationalism, sure, that probably was racial. Probably more than probably. It most likely is. It probably was. It was. But for the standard of what we're talking about national assimilation. So whenever those people come into this group, into this nation, doesn't really matter where they come from. It matters what they apply themselves in, how they operate within that society.
Sure. Then my question just goes back to the same thing. Italian and Irish Americans did not change any of the ways they behaved culturally when they were assimilated into whiteness, right?
They did change the way they acted. That's improper.
How so?
Linguistics. Linguistics is one of the fine contributing factors to American assimilation and people who assimilate into the American nationality. The loss of lingo. So Italian was widely spoken when they first came across because that was the mother language that they came from, their prior nationality, their prior culture. Coming into America, a lot of that lingo died, whether that be by generational loss, oratory malfunction, whatever it might be, it slowly gets stripped away, and stripped away in a good way. And this is sort of what I mean by you're kind of putting racial etiquette on nationalism, when American nationalism in the modern day and up in the 70s and 80s had completely flipped.
I would argue against this. I would say that the idea that in order to assimilate into American nationalism would be to change the way you culturally speak is directly a racist thing, especially when we look at the fact that Black Americans' vernacular is the way it was because we were forced to be uneducated for hundreds of years by America. So if they're forcing us to not be able to, like, they didn't allow us to read, they didn't allow us to learn how to read, to learn how to write, and then we created a vernacular specific to our cultural group, especially when we see the forceful movement of that cultural group into more urban areas, right? To then say, hey, we know that we made it so that you had to do this, but in order to be with us now, you have to. I think that's just. I'm sorry. What did you say?
That's not anti-American nationalism. So what I mean by
I'd say that's white supremacy.
Nationalism. So what?
I said that to me that would be white supremacy.
But I'm trying to argue that it's not, because American nationalism in the modern day doesn't revolve around race. To American white nationalists, it does. To American Black nationalists, it does. But to anyone who has a decent mind and actually follows the Constitution and tries to uphold those standard libertarian values and those values of the Constitution, egalitarianism, anyone who's read that or tries to follow it or tries to be a good nationalist should know that race has nothing to do with it. We have Spanish, French, English, Irish, Dutchmen, all as founding fathers. I don't think there is a racial etiquette that says, you can't speak that way, because Black lingo isn't Italian lingo. Italian lingo is a completely different language.
Yes,
Black
but when I asked you specifically what it was that Italian Americans did differently to assimilate into American nationalism, you said it was they changed their vernacular. So by this, it would be assumed that in order to assimilate, you have to remove the vernacular of your culture. But when that vernacular was created due to white supremacy, and white supremacy says, well, in order to be with us, you have to get rid of this. This is just white supremacy, forcing Black people to act, quote unquote, at the time, it would be quote unquote more white, is white supremacist.
I'm not making that argument. You keep saying I'm making the argument that you guys need to speak properly, and I'm not. My statement is on foreign language and national assimilation. So, because of the fact that the African American lingua, however you want to call it, it's Ebonics for reference, that is Americanism. That is American. As much as white nationalists don't want to agree to that, as much as blue collar workers and white men and whoever is on the top of the totem pole bitching you out, as you say, they don't understand that that was created in America. That is American. So I'm not making an argument that you guys need to speak properly. I'm making an argument that the assimilation factors between those white folks and the Black folks is the main disparity between racial difference. The only reason why white people are having a separate racial environment where they're not being persecuted as much, I think I've been called a Patty once in my life. That's all I've experienced, and that's my basis on it. But a lot of that has died because they assimilated, because they dropped those cultures. The only difference in that is because Black people were brought here as slaves and there was a racial etiquette placed upon them.
Yeah, but I asked you very directly, though. I asked you very directly what it was that Irish and Italian Americans had to do to assimilate, and you said it was the change of vernacular, right?
It
Now,
absolutely was, yes.
so then
A lot of
why?
people change vernacular when they do here, but they were never allowed to step outside of that racial etiquette. The idea that no matter how they acted, they were uneducated to the white man. And that value is absolutely redundant nowadays because there's a limited amount of the population who believes that, and most of them are old.
But it's not about the population. It's not about the population believing. This is why I talk about it being a systemic thing. It's still a systemic thing. If you go to a job interview and you speak strictly AAVE, or you speak in a quote unquote, for lack of better term, a white typical sounding voice, one person's going to get hired typically over the other. Right? AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, is still seen as an uneducated form of speech when it's not.
And I don't disagree with the statement that it is uneducated, but I also don't agree that it can't be used. You know, that is a proper form of speech. It is American. It uses English.
But even if somebody doesn't speak English, America doesn't have an official language.
We do. It's English.
No, English isn't. We don't have an official language, right? We all tend to speak English, but we've never written into
universal.
We've never written any policies about like what our language is, right? If the majority of people showed up here and started speaking Spanish, that would become the average language because that's what most people spoke. We don't have a written on the books official language. We just happen to speak English.
But we are universally speaking English. Almost everywhere across the United States, English is the primary language.
Yes, because that was the language of the people who settled the country. Settled. That was the language the people who colonized the country spoke in.
Yeah, that's the language that's officiatized. That's been
an official language has to be made official.
Okay. Well, we come from a very diverse group of Americans, the entire melting pot, so to speak. So making it official would be probably extremely problematic and would require a lot of pragmatic solutions. So there's probably a reason why it's not official, but the overall universal language of America is English. So there's really nothing to define that or to defeat that purpose other than saying it's not official. So
yeah,
like
but all I'm pointing out here is that the idea that in order to be a part of a national collective, you have to be able to communicate in the language that primarily spoken in that nation. That's nonsense. I assume you would agree that that's nonsense.
Nationalism.
I'm sorry?
It's not racist to ask people to speak your language.
Nobody has to. That's the whole point of being an American, is you don't have to speak English to be an American. You don't have to speak English to be nationalized in the country. Plenty of people pass their citizenship tests without ever learning a drop of English.
Right, but that's a national, not an assimilated national. There's a difference. Assimilated nationals can speak the language. I don't really care if you're proficient in it. It's just a value of speaking one of the languages we have here. And that's not a racist concept to ask someone to speak your language. It's like if I went to China and I got bitched out for speaking English. It happens. Other countries do this as well. It is not just us, and it's not a racist concept. That is modern liberalism at its work. In all concepts, you shouldn't have to stand there and say, yes, they're speaking Korean, so can't understand them. That's a problem. That is quite literally a problem. Whether we need better education,
forcing
or we
cultures.
need to increase the vocabulary studies on some of these children, I don't know the answer to it, but the statement is not to continue to let foreign languages overrun the English language.
Wait,
it's not
forcing cultures to assimilate to English when English wasn't even the language initially spoken in this country, right? Or I'll say on this continent, right? When English was not the language spoken here, when English was forced on the people who lived here by colonizers, yes, forcing English, this would be a white supremacist ideal. This is why Africa has a lot of predominantly English-speaking countries, because it was forced on them by European colonizers. That is a white supremacist thing.
Say that you're forcing the fact that I should accept other languages, which could be racial to me. That's pretty anti-white because I'm white. That you see how easy that argument is to construct. It's not one that can work.
The idea
of all based off personal perspective.
The idea of calling something anti-white is just white supremacy.
I think everything is white supremacy to you as long as it's involved in nationalism, which isn't very
No,
broad.
I've laid out very specifically why the things I believe are white supremacist are white supremacist. I don't call every single thing white supremacist. Good. Some stuff is classism. It has nothing to do with race. There's some, but forcing a white-centric language on the bulk of the world is white supremacy.
Okay, so because it's spoken by white people, it is inevitably a white language.
English started, English was predominantly a white language, yes.
Well, if this is the case, then I guess the Latins are a lot to blame for most of this. Perhaps we should take it a step back further. I mean, everyone uses the Latin script unless they're from the East, Far East, or South. Everyone does. So this concept that forcing it on other people is
Latin wasn't forced on anybody. Latin was adopted by European countries, and they took words in Latin and then formulated them to fit their language. Latin wasn't forced. Latin wasn't compelled speech.
That the white language has adopted, the white English language, as you quote, has adopted terms from all across the world.
Yes, this doesn't make English this doesn't negate the fact that English is a predominantly white language and there's a reason why there's a reason why there are a bunch of places in the world where people don't remember the language that they used to speak and now predominantly speak English. It was because colonizers wanted them to speak in a way they would quite literally beat the other languages out of them. This is white supremacy. And to argue that it's not is ahistoric.
It's quite literally not, though, because I'm trying to say this isn't white supremacy. I want to know, is it a white language because white people speak it, or is it a white language because it was created and founded, which wouldn't be true because it wasn't created by white people?
It is a white language because it was spoken predominantly by white Europeans who then forced it on. No. If it was strictly... Jesus Christ, dude.
You're a black man speaking English. That means that all of a sudden...
Yes, because my ancestors had their original language beaten out of them and were forced to speak English. So now I speak English. I wouldn't even know what language my ancestors originally spoke in because my ancestral line has been destroyed. It's been destroyed. I don't know who my ancestors are because when they brought over the slaves, they destroyed people's lineage. Right. So yes, there's linguistic supremacy, specifically linguistic.
That is a racist concept. That is
yes,
foolish.
It is.
That is
Linguistic white supremacy is quite literally a thing.
I do not want to call you names, but you cannot sit here and say that because something is spoken by white people, it is all of a sudden a white thing. That's like
I didn't. You interrupted me before I finished my sentence.
That is racist, bro.
I didn't say just because white people spoke it, it's a white language. You didn't let me finish my sentence. You didn't let me finish my sentence. I literally got interrupted by you while I was speaking. It's a twofold answer. It's a twofold answer. It's because English was a language predominantly spoken in white countries, and because that language was then forced onto other countries and cultures via colonialism and white supremacy expansion. And it was a way to force assimilation on groups that were not white. This is quite literally a thing that's documented as happened. Like you can disagree with it all you want, but to argue that this doesn't exist is nonsense.
Is it racist to go over to another continent and make them speak your language by force or not? How is that racist?
How is it racist to force another group of people to speak your language?
That is what I said. How is that racist? That has nothing to do with
How is it not?
You can't answer a question with another question. I went ahead and stated my point on that.
Sure. I'll explain it. I'll explain why it's racist. The reason that they forced them to speak another language was because they viewed their language as better than the language that these people spoke. They said our language is the one that's proper. Our language is the one that's more quote unquote clean. Our language is the language that will rise these savages, right, from savage to learned. And they viewed English as a predominantly, even they viewed English as a white language. So they knew that English was related. You see, you do this thing where I explain something and you just interrupt because you don't actually want to hear the explanation.
I'm not trying to. I thought you finished your point because you explained it. I was going to ask you, well, shit, if you're going to cut me off like that, I'm not. Damn, man. I can't even get to my answer.
You cut me off.
You answer your stuff pretty fucking well, man. There's no problem there. You quite literally stated it's a twofold answer when I asked about the racism, and that was the answer to my question. And you applied this rhetoric that sort of demonizes everyone who opposes you, and it doesn't work on everybody. And my point here isn't to sit here and prove you wrong. My point here is to have a discussion with you and actually figure things out, which is why I ask questions, and then I continue on once you answer that question. Because regardless, we're not going to stand on the same basis of agreement. So whenever you agree on something, it most likely has a different philosophy than mine. We're not on the same page when it comes to that. So the basis of your belief doesn't matter. It's the value of it. So just because you believe it because of these anecdotal events doesn't mean it's going to be truthful until it can be proven to the other side.
This is not what anecdotal events. That's not what anecdotal events are. That's not anecdotes.
Wanted to throw out some statements like, "Oh, I'm going to change these savages' language," and you acted as if you were quoting it from a book, and it really doesn't help because all you're doing is demonizing those colonizers. I don't care if you
colonizers should be demonized.
I would just say that's not a good political practice.
Colonizers should be demonized.
In all of this, do what?
Colonizers should be demonized.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what you think. Anyways, like I was saying, it's not your beliefs that are a concern to me in changing. It's the values of those beliefs. I come here for understanding, not to sit here and call you dumb, which is why I pulled away from those topics when you are claiming that a white spoken language is racist alongside the fact of them putting it on other people, which still isn't racist. That's cultural language. And also going further to debunk the point of your whole idea of these are savages, 50-50. That's a twofold answer, because for one part of that, yes, you are correct. They were like that. But there's also user perception error. They only understand their language. That is a brand new language that has been interrupted into their culture. If they have ships, they have guns, they have all these things that these tribals know nothing about, there is going to be a perception difference in how they view each other. Just like how I cannot remember what the specific tribe was, but one of these Spaniards came over and fired a gun, and they believed he was the coming Quetzalcoatl, the god of the sky, because it sounded like thunder. You have to understand that there are perceptual values that have gone throughout history that affect how we view it. Just like how you guys don't have the same assimilation factors as Black Americans. It's because you guys were forced into an etiquette. You guys were forced into having this social complex, and white people carried it. So I'm not trying to disprove your points. I am just saying that most of what you're going at is halfway. You're just demonizing and then standing on the dead graves, and it doesn't do you very well if you can easily point out that there are multiple societies and multiple cultures that coalesce in this way.
Yeah, so to answer a few of the things you said there, because you gish-galloped a little bit there. One, directly from the National Museum of American Indians, although there was a recognition of native rights to own land, official American documents used terms like savage and uncivilized to describe native people. They quite literally wrote these words into national documents.
You didn't quote it.
Hold on. You said that by saying this, I was using anecdotal evidence. I'm not. This is actual history, and to claim it's anecdotal is ahistoric. Second, we're not going to do this where I let you talk for 5 minutes and then I get to talk for a second.
No, I was just trying to figure out how that correlated. That's all I wanted to know, because there's also another statement you made about English.
And I'm going to get to it if you stop talking. I'm going to get to it.
Get to it then. Go.
I said I'm going to address the things you said. I started here. And I'm going to continue. Don't interrupt, and the shit will get answered. This is all you're doing. You're just trying to avoid the actual conversation by constantly interrupting them. Be like, well, why aren't you answering the question? Maybe stop talking. I would answer the question.
Now you could have just said it.
Great. So how about now you stop talking? Like, easy. Great. Thank you. So again, linguistic white supremacy is not only a thing that's currently studied by multiple people, but again, assimilation, as I've said multiple times, assimilation as a tactic of white supremacy is a way to remove anything they view as non-white. I've gone over this already. So by forcing, I'm gonna keep talking. By forcing the American.
Okay. This condescending attitude isn't going to get you anywhere.
If it's so, just talk, dude. If it's so important for you to talk, talk. If it's so important for you to talk, go ahead.
It's not.
It clearly is. It clearly is. If it was not important for you to talk, you would stop interrupting. But you keep doing it. So go ahead.
Oh, man. Okay. You keep making points, and you only cover them halfway. When you're saying I interrupted you, it's because I said who. When you said there are multiple people who study linguistics.
How about you wait until I'm done and then you can ask me who? That'd be the fun part. How about you wait till I'm done? But you want specifics? You want specifics? Look up the Metropolitan State University of Denver. Look up the Metropolitan State University of Denver. They talk about linguistic white supremacy. Ibram X. Kendi is one of the people who talks about it. Ibram X. Kendi is like one of the foremost researchers on the history of racism and race throughout the fucking globe.
Is he a professor or a speaker?
What?
Is he a professor or a speaker?
Ibram X. Kendi is a author and a historian.
Okay. That wasn't that hard. See, I just wanted to know who.
Yeah, but now I have to stop going off my it's a fucking tactic to get me to stop talking about what I'm talking about so that we can go down a fucking rabbit hole. Did me showing you, does it enhance the conversation that I pointed you out specific people that are talking about linguistic white supremacy? Or maybe you just stop talking and let me finish my entire point and then you can interject. Fucking not that hard.
You don't got to get pissy about
it's not that hard. Yes, but then I give you who and you go, well, what is that person? Who's the professor of this? I give it like it's 40 questions. It's fucking 5 questions to go through instead. You're just ducking the actual conversation. That's all you're doing.
Because you're losing your points. I have
nobody's losing. Yeah, my points are leaving my brain because you keep interrupting. So I don't know my fucking points because you interrupt everything I say. Do I need to replay the fucking tape to show that I don't even finish a sentence before you fucking chime in? Be so for real right now, dog.
I'm going to be cutting you off. If these were my points, why would I cut you off? They're your points. I am trying to get answer for yours, not like mine, bro.
You don't need to. When I say that linguistic whites, how about we do this? Is what's fucking great about debates. When I make the claim linguistic white supremacy is a study topic, you could just go, okay, I'll believe him, and if I disagree, I'll ask at the end. Make sense? Because I proved that it is a studied thing. I quite literally proved that it's a studied thing, and it's studied not only on a collegiate level, but by different historians. I've proved that. How about we just accept that now when I say something, I have a source to back it up.
You do know actual debates have the references written into the script prior. That way they have it there. They don't use Google like a Google warrior. You understand that, right?
Sometimes in collegiate level debates, sometimes in collegiate level debates, bro, all you're doing is fucking waffling because you don't want to have the actual conversation.
Someone who's unprepared. I hope you have a great day, buddy.
All you're doing is waffle. Yeah, you're waffled because you didn't have a fucking answer to anything. This is so nonsense, bro. Such nonsense, dude. Nothing but interrupting.